to the Situation Room. I'm your host, Paul, and joining me this week is Joaquin Flores and a friend of mine, Jerry. Joaquin, are you there?
I'm on the line.
Good. Jerry, you there?
Hello, gentlemen.
Well, what can I say? It's looking serious. This time, we want to discuss the Ukraine. Joaquin, what do you think? As of today, let's see, it's May 4th. How are things looking?
Things are looking like all of the indications tell me that we could be entering a civil war scenario.
Well, okay. If we're entering a civil war, then I guess the question is who wants it and who doesn't want it?
Right.
Who are the parties? Who are the factions here?
It looks like a part of the U.S. establishment wants it, and a part of it doesn't. It looks like a part of the European establishment wants it, but I'd say a bigger part of the European establishment does not. Russia does not want a civil war, but it does benefit at the present time from the media covering it like it's imminent, if that makes sense.
Tell me more. How does Russia benefit from the media coverage?
Sure. Well, ultimately, Russia will want to be able to act in the region, and they will be able to want to more openly assist and arm people living in areas that they expect will break away. And by highlighting some of the things that the Kiev junta is doing and emphasizing it, I don't want to say blowing it out of proportion, but by perhaps overemphasizing some of the things that they've done, they hope to create the right talking points to their friends who are in Europe to be able to sell this back to the constituencies that those politicians and corporations represent, say in Germany in particular. So by being able to heighten the sense that there are serious, say, human rights type situations which need immediate addressing, that can't be delayed, it gives friends in Europe the ability to sell that idea that ultimately Russia will have to intervene to restore order and, of course, to protect the safety of gas lines.
You know, speaking of this, just a few minutes ago or an hour ago or something, I saw on Twitter a tweet that essentially said there was a demonstration in Germany today with many, many thousands of people, essentially over this Ukrainian thing, the Odessa massacre, the fire, the death of whatever, 50 people by being burnt to death or whatever. So that's a big question.
It is, that's part of the information war and building up public support for the idea that this time around, and maybe the first time in European history since World War II, that we'll see sort of a script or a narrative where Russia is engaged in some fight against fascism, and that strong elements within Western Europe support this.
Well, I think we've already seen that some places like Marine Le Pen in France were essentially saying that, Putin has a reasonable position regarding things like the Crimea. Of course, the Ukraine is a lot more than just the Crimea, but that is definitely an issue there. Well, we're definitely looking at a media war more than a real war at the moment.
Right.
Do you think the odds? What would you say the odds are that it really actually turns into a nasty war?
Well, by nasty war,
say thousands dead, thousands
dead. I'd say 60%. Tens of thousands dead. I'd say 20%.
Okay.
Something that you said that sort of sparked my interest, though, in particular, was when you mentioned just now that Marianne Le Pen has come out on the side of Putin and Russia. And something that I think that your audience will appreciate and find interesting, Paul, is that the people historically who have voted for the National Front in France, some of the more radical elements in a previous incarnation would have been behind the Pravi sector in Ukraine. And so we've seen a big split in the nationalist scene in Western Europe. And also because some of the breakaway areas in the East have declared sort of like their worker states or people's republics, and waving red flags and defending statues of Lenin, this has inspired also the radical left in Western Europe. And so, and I wouldn't reach so far as to say this is like a Dugin-inspired project, although Dugin has been working in this area of connecting the radical right and the radical left. This is something which I think is really indicative of the phase we're entering into on the ideological front, where people are going to be divided ideologically between NATO and Eurasia, instead of, which is a geostrategic or geopolitical difference, perhaps, as opposed to, say, the traditional left and right.
Well, I think there's that. Oh, go ahead, Jerry.
I was just going to say, do you think maybe people are starting to wake up to the fact that they've been sold a false bill of goods with liberalism, Joaquin?
I think so. I think it's more that. And I mean, I think there's a lot of, without being abstract, I think there's a lot of great things that 17th and 18th century thinkers, contributed that might be considered liberal or, but right, liberalism in its modern incarnation, or neoliberalism or neoconservatism, I think a lot of people are waking up. Absolutely.
Well, add to that, I mean, really, as a practical matter, you don't have any choices, right? I mean, you get NATO, you get the EU, you get a bureaucratic dictatorial state, no matter what.
Right.
If you live in Spain or you live in Canada or what, I mean, you don't have any say.
Right.
The parties are the same. There are 2 or 3 parties, and they all say the same speeches. I mean, I think, was it with the Iraq War? You had, I forget, but it was something like the Canadian Prime Minister and the Australian Prime Minister said the same speech at the same day about, going to war with Iraq or something.
Yeah, it was verbatim. Yeah. Verbatim, I believe.
Yeah.
Now think about that. So if in either case, if you're a Canadian or an Australian, I mean, how more obvious can it get? That your Prime Minister is just like a script reader. Where did the script come from? Washington? London? I don't know, but
right.
It's pretty pathetic. And so this is very frustrating, whether your tendencies are left or right or libertarian or green or whatever. It's really, there's a massive anti-establishment sentiment that is just waiting to explode, I think, in the entire Western world. So that's one issue. But getting back to the Ukraine, because this is really so vital, we could see things blow up in a bunch of different ways. So you would argue, I heard you say that so far the war has basically been a holographic war.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's true, but I would add one little thing. I mean, if you talk to military people, they will say that, like in the Chechen War or something, you can knock down some checkpoints, but you can't spend the night there. You'll be sitting ducks to a guerrilla attack.
Right.
And so, in a sense, what we've seen, and I heard a BBC guy saying, this is all for like TV show. Right?
Mm-hmm.
They shoot something, come to the front of it, take a picture, and then they retreat.
Right.
And so that's what you're saying. It's holographic. And I agree with you. But on the other hand, what's hard to figure out is it they've just been ordered to do that, and so they do it, or is it they're actually just afraid that if they spend the night inside the town, they'll get shot, or maybe it's both. I don't know.
I think it's both. I think you raise a great point. I mean, to what extent is it holographic on purpose, or is it holographic accidentally? I mean, I think that it's I have some background in this area, and what it strikes me as is similar to when people are trying to build, stock before an IPO. They're trying to build that stock value before an IPO, and they do kind of like stunts to get people on board with it. And I think that they've made a lot of little actions to try to stimulate support or to try to make it look like something bigger is happening, because then you can use like the moment of the hysteria of the moment to sell it to arms manufacturers who then who are lobbyists, and then they pressure people in various congresses and parliaments in the West. So and that's what also struck me as primarily what was happening with the reference to NATO activity and the 600 or 700 or 800 soldiers that have been placed into places like Poland and in the Baltic states. So to me it seems like, well, that maybe they could try to get some arms deals out of it, and they could saber rattle. In many ways, though, it seems like the West is in a process of trying to figure out how to untangle themselves if the Russians don't take the bait. And so far, the Russians have not taken the bait.
It seems like on the ground, Joaquin, that the both have a whole lot of interest in massacring each other, aside from, say, the right sector thugs and the soccer hooligans. It just seems like, as you said, it's holographic, but also I don't think that the hatred is really there as much as it's portrayed. Would you say that's accurate?
I'd say that's accurate. And, one of the things is that there's been significant infighting recently in between the liberal pro-junta nationalists who support the Kiev government and the Pravi sector who see themselves engaged in right now what they call the second revolution. So there's been a significant split on the pro-Kiev side, and one of the things, and it's like you say, is that the liberal nationalists, while they don't have a lot of love for people who consider themselves Russian who live in the east of Ukraine, they certainly don't want to see innocent people being killed, or they don't want to see the coercive elements of the state used against people who are protesting. Maybe because of their sense of humanity, or some sense that they can rebuild the nation, so they have some national interest, or maybe out of their liberal values as well, which don't always have the worst elements insofar as that goes. But what you do see is the Pravi sector, seriously trying to. They're now at war with both sides. They're at war with the a propaganda war on the people who are the foot soldiers in the Pravi sector, and Svoboda supporters see themselves as being on a war of two fronts, both against federalist separatists who they call communists, and then with the government who they see as being too close to the West. But there's so many layers there, and it's like really messed up, actually, because the leadership of the Pravi sector is, of course, entirely and has always been run by Operation Gladio and Radio Svoboda and Radio Free Europe and Voice of America, but how the leadership, which is entirely just how Al Qaeda is run, right? So the leadership is entirely sort of on board with the U.S. project, but the foot soldiers really need to believe that they're against both Eurasia and NATO. And so there have been some street fights and stuff in Kiev. It happened a few nights ago. It was pretty big and pretty bloody. I think 1 or 2 people got killed and 50 or 60 people were injured. Police made a lot of arrests. And then, of course, you saw the situation happen in Odessa the other day, where 40 people were killed in a fire that right sector people lit of the trade union building in Odessa, and that was tragic. And in that case, it looked like that the Kiev government, made an agreement with the Pravi sector to do that, because you could see the police in Odessa were standing back and allowing it to happen. So
that actually may serve Kiev's interests. Would you say, because if they want to get rid of the right sector, if they allow them to run around like lunatics and discredit themselves, then that will make Kiev's job easier to get rid of them.
Yeah, I agree with you. The problem is they want to get rid of them at the right time, and so far, they're able, if they can just get them to not do stupid things, but to integrate into paramilitary militias and can take orders from Kiev through, say, Yarosh. But even the Pravi sector is actually like a front of about 5 or 6 main nationalist groups. And Yarosh is kind of like a spokesperson, and he's the leader of like the main right sector group. But they're not all, they have their own divisions, and they kind of have their own little mini bosses and stuff like that. And I think you're right that it does make Kiev look bad, and maybe Kiev is served from that. But we've seen, U.S. State Department and even Obama have made apologetics for the events that happened in Odessa, saying that the, Kiev government has the right to do this. So it, to sort of back up a little bit, my sense is that the general script that we're seeing being read to us is that we have, in essence, the United States trying to provoke Russia to do something decisive before the internal processes in the south and in the east of the country can take place, if that makes any sense. Because then they could paint Russia as annexing and invading, not in the American mainstream media, but in the European media, where the discourse is a little, like maybe 1 or 2 degrees more sophisticated, less so than it used to be, of course. But I think you can see how that.
Well, Joaquin, then
Yes.
I've got a question here. Okay,
Sure.
So we can discuss these gangs of different sorts, right? Pravi sector and all that.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're looking at it from a strategy of if you were working for the U.S. trying to gin up a war, a civil war,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in a sense, those guys are cover. They're not actually what you need to do the heavy lifting. The
Right.
heavy lifting, you need professionals. You need the
Yes,
actual
absolutely.
Operation Gladio. You don't need the guys who, are pretend. In
Right.
other words, the guys who carry pipes and beat
Right.
up unarmed guys and push them into buildings and set the buildings on fire. That,
Right.
you know what I mean? In other words, that's to raise the temperature of the country. That's,
Right.
you know what I mean? That's got its purposes,
Yes.
to anger everybody,
Exactly.
to radicalize all people in the country or the city or whatever. So Odessa today is not the same city it was a month ago. No way.
Exactly. Right.
Right?
Exactly. No going back. No going
There's
back.
no going back after that. That you don't. And by the way, they weren't just burnt. I mean, the reports from the police are, I don't know, maybe out of the, let's say, 50 dead, 6 or 7 of them were shot.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that was a case where the new junta-appointed governor got rid of the police chief because he didn't want to have that happen. You know what I mean? In other words, that was an orchestrated event from Kiev.
Yes.
And everybody in Odessa knows that.
Right.
And there's no going back on that. But to actually do serious, heavy lifting beyond guys with pipes and Molotov cocktails, you want the Blackwater types or whatever, retired
Right.
special forces who now work for Gladio somewhere.
Right.
And there are reports that, we can't be sure of, but there are reports in all kinds of, Russian websites and whatever with photos and videos and discussions and so on, that they are appearing throughout the eastern Ukraine. And
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not sure. But if you were strategizing trying to start the war,
right,
a civil war, I would think that push comes to shove, guys with pipes will not do it.
Sorry. Yeah, guys with pipes won't do it, and it's really the snipers and the hitmen and the special forces guys. Some are coming in from the northern European states, others from Germany, others from the United States. One of the things that's going to be a problem, however, is that you need to have significant number of Ukrainian speakers in command of larger units, and there's a big language barrier, and it's one of the comparisons that's often made, obviously, is with the Arab Spring fiascos, where a bunch of foreign fighters were imported into the country, into Libya or into Syria, and because they can speak literary Arabic, or they can speak generic Arabic, they can, at least while they're obviously identifiable as being not Syrians or not Libyans in the respective conflicts, that at least they could integrate into the forces, and they could, like, give orders, receive orders. I mean, when someone says jump, there's a bomb, or and you don't speak the language, or hey, we're gonna all move, it's really difficult. A lot of these guys don't speak the language, and language schools, the conflict that they had been preparing for and had been involved in, where the language schools were geared towards learning Arabic. And this situation, while they had done a lot of planning, a lot of the say Blackwater types that they rely on, there's a significant language barrier, to summarize. So, and there's other issues too, like the fact that there won't be as many available low-grade mercenaries, and you don't have also the volunteer element, where you're not going to get people from madrasas in Saudi Arabia to volunteer to go fight in Syria. I mean, you've got maybe 10 or 20 kids, literally kids like under 25, skinny kids. I'm talking about, no military background, from Sweden and Norway and France, who are excited that there's a fascist revolution happening in Ukraine, and they go show up and put helmets on, but they're not like the Wahhabi guys at all, you see. So it's definitely going to be a national conflict with some smattering of Blackwater types, but their efficacy is really questionable.
Well, I guess I'm glad to hear that. It just always seems so much easier to destroy things than to build.
Right. Yeah.
Well,
something...
Clearly, though, I mean, they have a limited number of people, and that's why, again, like we're saying, it hasn't really been a full war at this point. I mean, it's a lot of people going to nearby an area and then just parking. You got a lot of military not doing anything.
Right.
And okay, let's get to a big question. The question of
Sure.
Who has time on his side.
Yeah.
Okay, because I think this is a big question. A lot of people who are kind of backing Russia in the Western Anglo-sphere world are nervous that, Russia doesn't seem to be doing anything. And, well, other than, let's just say, taking the Crimea was a huge, huge deal, right? But setting that aside, I mean, I don't know. I look at Russian websites. I mean, I just looked at one a minute ago, and that's covering the action in the eastern Ukraine. Like, there are websites in the Crimea, and that there are all these reports coming in, and they frequently have videos or photographs of things too. But I mean, just a minute ago, they were implying that one of the borders has been broken through. The Ukrainians have given up on defending the border with Russia.
Right.
And that was always one of my signs. Is once you lose the border,
right,
then there's no telling who's coming and going. And if Russia, or even if they don't want to send in special forces, they want to just send in volunteers with medicine, quote unquote.
Right.
Once the border's broken, that's it. And so if that's true, then we're getting closer to the point where there's more overt Russian support.
Yeah.
But anyway,
I mean,
the time. Who do you think has time on his side in this case?
Russia has time on its side in this case. It's the United States, in particular, is trying to place a wedge between Europe and Russia, and they're running out of time to do that. And that's why I think that in the 6 days remaining in the run up to the big election in Donetsk Oblast, that you're going to see twice as many people die in the coming week, possibly, than we've seen since from February up until now. Okay, and you will see an increase in the mercenary Blackwater activity. Some of them more. There are some people from Pravi sector who are like militia trained and veterans of different conflicts and are excellent shots and survivalists and everything. You will see these people. You will see some madness. You will see. Then there will be the elections on the 11th, and then you're going to see violence at the polls, and you're going to see people trying to say that actually it was the Russians that were intimidating voters, and the election most undoubtedly will favor joining Russia, and that will be on the ballot in just 7 days from now. So
that's
I think that
the referendum you're referring to in the
yeah, that's
okay.
Right. And that's going to be
Joaquin, there are two referendums, right, for Lugansk and Donetsk, right?
That's correct.
Okay, now they're both for the whole provinces, the whole oblast.
Yeah,
right?
Right.
Okay, but now I would imagine that if the capital city, in either case, got surrounded or laid waste to or got, gassed from the sky all day long, that then there's no way those elections could take place.
I agree. So in that scenario, you would see about a week or two of an increase of signs of a civil war type thing. Then you will see a shift in a continual shift in European popular opinion as reflected through statements from prime ministers and media personalities. And then you will see a increase of declarations from the Russian side, and then you will see that there will be more of a military type accretion of the area, but they will have it done as a popular revolution because it's in, Donbass is the major industrial area. In fact, the wealth of Ukraine is in fact in the east, right? So in fact, the West is kind of a liability, and if Poland wants to pick up that rump state, that's up to them. But for example, you have in Akieva, they have the miners have had a general strike going on, and that's a significant mining complex. It's the largest in the country, I think, and they are 100% behind the Russian effort, and this is why we're seeing like this very strange hybrid of left-wing and right-wing politics, because you have Cossack fighters who see themselves as like defenders of the monarchy and the imperial tradition, fighting alongside people who consider themselves Stalinists or communists, and then the trade unions, the workers and stuff, they always have ties with socialists and communists too. So when we see now, for example, major points of production, this is going to be really important to sell to the left in Europe and even in the U.S. In the same way that Chavez was able to sell his coup in Venezuela 12, 14 years ago, 15 years ago now, to the left. They'll stage worker occupations. We've already seen the declaration of people's republics, and then behind the scenes.
But Joaquin, does that mean that they're going to nationalize the oligarchs' wealth?
Yes, it does. But the thing is that one of the problems in the West that we encounter is that because of some of the I would say the more popular writers from the Austrian school, and because of the way we understand the issue of property, really, and the law, Americans don't really, or the West rather, in the far West, there's not a clear concept of what a party state is. And so you will see that
if there are means of production that are not nationalized, the men who own those means of productions will be nationalized, if that makes sense. So
well,
they might still.
They could always get them on tax evasion, right?
Right. I mean, they could get them on tax evasion, or threaten that they would get them on tax evasion, or any other number of things like that, and force them. They can basically regulate things like profit margins, where they can invest, how they can invest, where they keep their money. In other words, now we see that Switzerland is no longer a neutral country, and so no more Swiss bank accounts. And so if you could force the oligarchs, or as the Marxists would call the bourgeoisie, to keep their money in Russian banks, and that those then bank managers are forced to loan primarily to Russian-based initiative capital investments and entrepreneurial endeavors, then you would have effectively nationalized those means of productions. Now, the workers that seize the metallurgical plant, for example, they're fighting for workers' control, and they have more of a workerist or Marxist type ideology, but they're fighting alongside. They're being reinforced by Cossacks. So I mean, this is something that we have never seen in history before, where elements of the radical left and forces that we consider on the radical right are working together. And the same thing is happening in Europe, right? Because you have the Social Democrats, making excuses for their fascists of the Pravi sector. So you have their version of a similar thing, where people who grew up calling themselves, Marxist light, who are in parliament in different European countries, are publicly pretending that the Pravi sector is not a neo-Nazi and fascist outfit. So it's a real strange phenomenon. I think this is real significant, Paul, that we're moving into a post-ideological age, and the underlying geostrategic and geopolitical truths are being more widely disseminated, and people are thinking in a global sense now as opposed to a political sense.
Well, when I mentioned the nationalization, I mean, there's the nationalization of the elite that Putin is always trying to do, which means not letting them have their money in London or Switzerland or whatever. But then there's the nationalization of the property, because the fact is that these oligarchs are basically criminals. They're mafia leaders who succeeded and got legalized by going into politics. At least half of them. And so,
I mean, that's how the world works, right?
Yeah, it's good to be king. Right? I mean, if you win, then you were right.
Right.
But what I'm trying to say, though, is, first of all, that's, I think, the big cause of the problems in the Ukraine. It's not simply the U.S. or Germany or Russia throwing their weight around, right? It's that the poor country's been abused hopelessly, and it was kind of an artificial creation with all these different regions put together. And so nothing ever happened except the corruption got worse and worse. But getting into that, today, the last couple of days, a number of banks have been burnt in the eastern Ukraine, all of them by the terrible oligarch Kolomoisky, or whatever his name is. Kolomoisky. Yes. And it's looking like there's an uprising against the rich starting.
Yes.
And do you see that continuing?
I see it continuing to the extent that it will be useful. This is the same maneuver that the Soviet Union used towards the end of World War II in Italy, for example, notably, and in part in Greece, although Greece spiraled off into the civil war. But in Italy, for example, the agreement between the Soviets and the Americans, of course, was to legitimize the post-fascist government by placing it in the pretext of a workers' uprising, because the anti-Mussolini forces in Italy were basically the communists, and there weren't pro-American or pro-capitalist partisans fighting against Mussolini at any point in Italy, right? And likewise, in the East, in Ukraine, what mobilizes mass numbers of people through the grassroots organizations, the trade unions, and the left-wing parties is this, people against profits paradigm that we associate with the traditional radical left. So will these go forward? No, I don't think that they're going to create like a socialist republic of Donbass or Donetsk. But I do think that that some of their demands and some of their platform will be integrated into the Constitution, but it will still be a, how would I say, republic that represents, different walks of life and different economic classes. So I don't think it's going to be like a worker state in the Marxist sense, if you know what I'm saying. But they will definitely use that language to mobilize people.
But Joaquin, I was talking more tactically in the sense that the oligarchs have been the problem there, and they're really the cause of what we see today.
I agree.
And so if you threaten to harm them enough, they may, go from being against the Eastern Ukraine to becoming neutral or something. And that would make all the difference in the world. I mean, that's kind of what I'm asking, because right now you've got these oligarchs who have massive holdings in the Eastern Ukraine.
Yes.
And if and when they come to the conclusion that they're at risk of losing them all,
right,
then they may, if not switch sides, at least say, go to whoever they think they need to go to. I don't know if that's Putin or not. And just say, what kind of deals do we need to make here?
Oh, I think we're saying the same thing, Paul. I think we're saying that, yeah, indeed, that these sort of left-wing or worker militant seeming uprisings and activities against oligarchs aren't going to they're not going to spin off into like some kind of socialist state in that part of the country, but rather it's used as pressure politics to push these oligarchs to either neutralize them or get them to abandon their support for the Kiev junta. Absolutely, I think that's probably what is happening. But it's always, there's always an element of the unknown, if and I think that one danger in stoking the class element in a society is that once you've mobilized a certain density of the population and you've got that idea, that contagious idea stuck in their head that the oligarchs must be taken down, it is really difficult to disabuse people of that idea. And so I think that while you're absolutely correct that this is primarily at the top levels being seen as a tactic or a strategy connected to a broader strategy of neutralizing the oligarchs in the East, I think that at the same time that another consequence running parallel to this will be that you will see more populist economic provisions included in the local constitution, and that the trade union leaders and socialist leaders in that part of the country will have an increased role in governance as they join with the Russian Federation.
While we're on the note of the oligarchs, any guesses as to who shot the mayor of, I think it was Kharkiv, Gennady Kearns? What's the rumors floating around on that?
Yeah,
I believe he's in an Israeli hospital now.
Right. Well, the Kiev is saying it's the Russians, and Russians are saying the guy's got so many enemies that it was just, I don't have a good guess on that. My feel is that in general, these types of situations of social unrest are great times to even the score, all kinds of personal disputes. I mean, obviously, these people are reviled and hated by so many people, even their own peers that they've screwed over the years, that, you have a situation of unrest and these guys get offed. I mean, it's just as likely that it was just, personal score being settled as it is to say that it was politically motivated. So your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah.
What about elections coming? Do you think that there's a national election scheduled for May 25th, and then there are these two referendums for May 11th. Do you think that any elections are likely to be postponed? Any new elections to come up? What? Give us the general view of elections.
My sense is that the elections on the 11th will happen on schedule, with the types of violence that I've described, and that the election on May 25th will only involve part of the country, because by that time the other parts of the country won't really be part of Ukraine. So
when you say that, are you just talking about those two provinces, or are you talking about that more will in some form or another declare themselves independent?
I think those will likely see I think we've already seen the framework for that being laid down, because because Capitol buildings have been seized in other provinces, in other oblasts. But when the general tactic that the way the Russians are going to game this, right, is that because Sarev is now out of the race, there is not one single person running on the May 25th election that represents any of the Party of Regions voters. And they were the people that won the last election, and they represent, as you know, the South and the East and the very far west tip of Ukraine as well, where you have the Carpathians,
Hungarians,
and Hungarians and Carpathians and Ruthenians, right?
So at the end of the day, when this is all said and done, Joaquin, do you think, are we going to end up with about 4 or 5 or 6 different republics in the South and East, or do you think we're going to have some type of federation of Novo Russia?
Yeah, it's going to be both. But it's going to be, they're going to be part of the Russian Federation ultimately, but they're going to have the status of being their own republics as well as part of the Russian. So they're not going to be part of the Russia part. It's going to be how you have Tatarstan, Kazakhstan, and so forth. You're going to have, or you have Crimea still an autonomous republic, and so on. So it's part of the Russian Federation, but it's not. They have their own local leadership that makes executive level decisions, right? So that's what you're going to see mirror. But I think. Mm-hmm.
Well, okay. Here's a question though: if the old historical Novorossiya came back, which includes the south and east of current Ukraine, no matter how you slice it, you're going to get a fair number of Ukrainians in there.
Right.
There's Kherson, there's Petropavlovsk, or Petropavlovsk.
Mm-hmm. Right. There's Ukrainian towns.
And you know how, even Kharkov, the number 2 city in the country next to the border with Russia. Yeah, but in today's modern world, you have kind of, how there's, like in the United States, people move from one big city to the other.
Sure.
Right, and so a place like Atlanta doesn't have any Southerners in it anymore. Okay, just kidding. But you know what I mean. The point is that Kharkov is, whatever it might be, but it's certainly not going to be more than about 80% Russian. Just because you've got a business, bureaucratic, governmental class that moves around nowadays.
Right.
And so does Russia proper want a whole bunch of Ukrainians in it who are not really totally happy about being in Russia?
Okay, let me try to. That's a great question. I think that's a critical question in looking at the post scenario. Mm-hmm. The framework to keep in mind is that Ukrainians in general, many of them are Russian speaking, and others, like in the West and little enclaves who aren't involved in a lot of business but work in local economy, they might not speak a lick of Russian. But anyone who speaks Russian is I'm going to use neutral terms as much as possible, but they're prone to Russian propaganda. And another major factor is that Ukraine existed without incident as part of the Soviet Union in its modern form from sometime in the 30s all the way until 1991. And all those Ukrainians happen to live and build lives and have children, go to school and, go to work as connected to a Moscow-based government. And what is, I think, more significant moving forward is the fact that anyone who's living in the rump state, whether they're Hungarian, Ukrainian, Polish, Galician, are going to be hit with this $16-17 billion IMF loan, which includes all the structural adjustment provisions with all the austerity measures and the doubling, tripling, quadrupling of prices of different goods and services, the decrease of the retirement, increase of the retirement age, decrease in wages and in pensions, layoffs, just all of the things you see all over the world whenever the IMF comes in with its neoliberal economic plans. The people, whether they're Ukrainian or Nazi sympathizers or whatever they are, who live in the part that's going to be Russia, are not going to be faced with this. And on top of that, I think we can imagine that the old sweetheart deal that Russia gave to all of Ukraine, where they really didn't charge them for gas, actually. You're going to see that. You're going to see that fuel. You're going to see this basically free gas from Russia fuel the whole Malorussian economy. And you're going to see a lot of capital investment from Russia, China, and you're going to see it's going to be like the reversal of East and West Germany, right? You're going to see basically like an impoverished IMF neoliberal co-prosperity zone in the West, and in the East, you're going to see continued modernization, development of infrastructure, functioning civil society, relatively low debt, higher earnings. And I think these types of economic realities will be a huge demotivator to any sort of rebellious, Ukrainian sentiments that, that might exist in pockets of towns or whole small regions.
Well, you're also making the argument why many say that the Ukrainian military will try hard to help the Russian military.
Right.
It's because the salaries are 3 or 4 times greater and the pensions start when you're 5 years younger and whatever, right? Right. And so the economy, the economic issues, and this is true with the Crimea too. I mean, let's face it, in the, people voting in the referendum in the Crimea, do you want to join a place where the salaries are 4 times better and the pensions are similarly better, if not more so? Right?
Right.
I mean, think about that. Or, I mean, that's not a fair choice. It's like, let's say there was some dispute on the border zone between El Paso and Juarez in Mexico, right? And they said, oh, we screwed this border up 100 years ago. We're going to have an election. The UN is going to decide, right, what part of El Paso should join Mexico or what part of Juarez should join the United States. Right? And you say, well, okay, but let's be honest here. El Paso is a very Mexican city, right? Right. But the big difference is like pensions and, whatever thing, economically you're better off. A lot of people in Juarez might just say, well,
join the United States,
difference?
right?
What's the difference?
Right.
I mean, put me in the U.S. if I'll make 3 times as much money.
Right, exactly, right.
Right, and I'm not saying this is good or bad, right? I'm just saying it's the economics of it are quite important.
Right.
And so I agree with you. That's another factor that will lessen the discontent. But I don't think you can ignore. I think all countries nowadays have a more mobile class than they used to, and there will be people in the Russian part of the Ukraine who are not totally happy about, being stuck in Russia, and then there are going to be Russians stuck in the western part of the Ukraine who are not exactly happy about that.
Yeah, I suspect they'll try to move ASAP. But yeah, I mean, it's the thing is that it's like we can't think about this situation in static terms, or I mean, sure, I mean, it's I'd say 80-90% sure done deal already that the area we're describing as Russia is going to join with the Russian Federation. I think that's going to happen with violence, 500 dead, 1,000 dead, but I don't think it's going to escalate much beyond that. What's really going to be the stuff that hits the fan is what's going to happen with the rump state of Ukraine. I mean, there's no, without the mining and the industry and the smelting and the service sector and the telecom and that all basically supports Kiev. How are they going to actually have a country? And under the international law, the continuity of agreements precedent that's already been established. I mean, whether Ukraine has a new government or not, they still owe everything they already owe. I mean, the 17 billion that they got from the IMF, was the IMF allowed to be sold, right, a false bill of goods by the Kiev.
Well, Joaquin, they might have a new name. They may say they're not the Ukraine. They might become. The problem is that you can renaming a country. They would have to make an argument. It would be international law and everything. But thing is that the IMF isn't going to want to let them off the hook because they rename it. I mean, it's going to be the courts. The courts that make that determination are the same courts that are owned by the IMF in effect anyway. So okay, got a question for you, Joaquin.
Yeah,
got a question.
Sure, right.
Do you think that the powers that be, Russia, the US, EU, or whatever, Germany, are reasonably close to actually having a deal in mind? They just break up the country in 4 places and they're arguing over the edges of it right now.
I feel honestly like I'm stuck in that movie Groundhog Day. It's like I feel like what is this, like, insanity? What's really going on right now? The discourse in the United States is they're pretending that they want to propose a situation that keeps Ukraine intact, the current borders minus Crimea, and that they allow Ukraine to be more like Finland and not necessarily join the EU and definitely not join NATO, and be allowed for Russian to invest and for Europeans and Americans to invest. And I'm going, what? Dude, this is exactly what they had before the U.S. tried to pull this whole coup. I mean, that was the situation that was kind of working out for everybody beforehand, before the U.S. went crazy. So, but no one is talking about any kind of agreement where Russia takes the eastern and southern part of the country. And I mean, that's actually what Russia would prefer right now, and the U.S. doesn't prefer. They're just doing that crazy bureaucratic official talk where they act like they want to make some proposal that actually would revert back to the situation that they were against in the first place. It doesn't seem like it.
Stop there. There's a second. Okay. Mm-hmm. I mean, politics and diplomacy are full of, I guess what you would politely say, the need to fudge.
Right.
Putin and the Russian representatives inside the Ukraine, right, have always had to say, we love the Ukraine. We love the idea of the Ukraine. It's just the best thing that's ever happened in history, right? And we just want us all to work together and have a great future, right?
Right.
All the while, they're making their plans out of self-interest that, well, it looks like we got to break up, right? I mean, it's just the way of the world. And similarly, you know, with the EU or whoever, we're saying, oh, we want the Ukraine to join the EU as soon as possible. It's just that will be about 60 years from now. Right? I mean, they're just lying, is what I'm trying to say, because they're just not telling the truth. That's all. It's very simple. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, it's not a matter of what their official words are. It's, you know, we're speculating here. What does it look on the ground like? These attacks have still been holographic for the most part, as you say. 50 dead, 70 dead is a tragedy, but it's also, you know, a bad night in Detroit or whatever. You know, it's not the end of the world. And, you know, it seems to me that the U.S. could definitely escalate if they wanted to. I mean, they could put far more mercenaries. They could start blowing things up. They, you know, look at Syria. They got the ability to put bombs in big places and kill 50 people in one go.
I think that's what you're going to see this coming week. I mean, if I could go out, you know, on the ledge and say that here, you know,
hey, but we're on the limb here.
You know, hey, it's there's a great chance it's going to happen. I think that in the coming week we're going to see twice as many people than what we've seen, you know, this whole time. So it's going to be, you know, killed, I'm saying. But at the same time, I think you're right that there are some strong tendencies looking at rapprochement, and I think that this is primarily coming from the European side. I think the Russians and the Europeans actually see eye to eye with this. Having some inside information about the Pravi sector and Svoboda and what they see as their goal, and sort of how some of the people who support even the Kiev junta on the official levels think is going to happen, is they see a centerpiece that's not Europe and not Russia, that connects the Baltic states with Poland and Ukraine and possibly Romania. And they see that together, all of this territory with all of its population and, you know, capacity, productive capacity and economic might could be a real force. This is exactly what Donald Rumsfeld and the neocons actually proposed well over 10 years ago in a white paper that was published on the Project for a New American Century website publicly. And it strikes me as so strange and coincidental that the same people who are running things now in Ukraine and the more radical elements in the Pravi sector all agree that this is, you know, Rumsfeld called this New Europe. And I think that they do want to blow up gas lines, and they do want to ultimately, they would love to carve out a sphere that separates the western part of Central Europe and Western Europe from the eastern part of Central Europe and Eastern Europe, and have Russia isolated by land. This is all about connecting things by land, as we discussed in the last show. So,
well, you got to give them credit for being ambitious.
Yeah, they're definitely ambitious. Yeah, I give them credit for that.
Because, I mean, just off the top of my head, I mean, not even, I mean, I'm aware of this thesis, by the way, because of Rumsfeld, but, you know, the Baltic states are ridiculously vulnerable. The populations are small. Latvia is probably at least 30% Russian, and then, I don't know, another 10% other things maybe. The Russian economic influence and then the gas, I think they get basically 100% of their energy from gas, from Russia, means that Russia could take them down without working up a sweat.
That's right.
Certainly in the case of Latvia, because they could just do the color revolutions and the Russians living there are very discriminated against. So they have all kinds of legitimate grievances.
Yeah.
So you look at that, and you have to say, I mean, is that all there is? I mean, that can't really be, I mean, having NATO missiles there is a big deal because it's so close to Russia. But, but I mean, economically speaking or something, I just don't quite get it. I mean, Romania seems like a much more, serious question, or Poland. But, and I mean, and look, Poland forced them to go with Nord Stream. I don't know. I mean, I see this, but it just doesn't. I mean, if that's your strategy, it seems so. I mean, all you need are a couple breaks in it, and it doesn't work, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's
and
the
so,
thing.
Okay, let's ask a few questions here. First of all, what about the South Stream? Do you think that's going to go through?
Oh, that's going through. Yeah. In fact, they did break ground already, like ceremonially, and by the end of the summer, there'll be a lot of digging going on. And I know that the construction here in Serbia will begin on August 12th, August 15th. So there's no reason to think that won't happen. They did change the course, whether it was going to cut across the Adriatic or if it was going to involve Croatia. And I think that they've now decided to include Croatia. And Russian policy, well, in Russian circles, they still refer to the region as Yugoslavia.
Right.
Here, and I think they would like to see rapprochement between the Croatians and the Bosniaks and the Serbs, and the latest public airing of how the South Stream will go down is going to now include Croatia and I believe Bosnia, and then it'll cut across the Adriatic.
So you don't think the EU can sabotage it?
Well, it'd be sabotaging itself again. I mean, it's because the Italians are. It's going to end in Italy, and the Italians are behind it. So it's at the very most it would stoke some division between Germany and Italy, because right now Italy gets its Russian gas through Germany, and now and so Germany's able to add
but
some
Joaquin,
like
this is assuming that countries exist, right? I mean,
right.
in a sense,
right.
they're just pieces controlled by bankers, right?
Right.
I mean, the who's in charge of Italy? Some Goldman Sachs guy. Who was before him? Some other Goldman Sachs guy. Who'll be next? Another Goldman Sachs guy, right? So, we're in the post-democracy era. The EU doesn't have any elections that matter, right? It's right. Who voted for Van Rompuy or all of these people, Ashton and whoever all these people are, right?
Yeah,
so you know what I'm saying? I mean, it's not totally a question of what the people in Italy want or the businesses want. It's a question of who's got the power to stop it or make it. What about any gas coming through Azerbaijan and Georgia? Do you think that is that possible, or you think
it's possible. I think that people who look at Azerbaijan don't consider it stable enough, because Azerbaijan could change course pretty easily. So and Turkey looks like it might change course too. I mean, a lot of things are changing right now. It in many ways reminds me, and not that I was alive to see it, but it reminds me of the period around 1910 in historical terms, where you get these alliances and shifting alliances, and it looks a lot like sort of situation we've seen in the past.
Well, geez, that makes us all feel warm and fuzzy. It's feeling like 1910. Great. I'm just glad to hear it. Lots of change in the air. It's springtime. Springtime for the Ukraine. Springtime for everybody. Okay, it's feeling like 1910. Well, I don't know. I think the question as far as the Ukraine, though, is what if it does get ugly, U.S. pushes the EU aside and escalates it for whatever reason, what are some of the things that we might see? Do you think the U.S. might go back to
Sure.
trying to smash Syria, or
Sure.
what are, first of all, are there any signs we should look for? Anything that might happen that you think is important?
I think that the big signs we've already seen, and that is Obama has already said, and I'm not saying Obama has power, but the things he says are important in terms of what we saw happen in Syria when the Americans backed off. Obama has already ruled out NATO involvement in Ukraine. He said that 2-3 weeks ago. So now involvement means officially deploying, the NATO forces, not, of course, the mercenaries and all the intrigue, but I think that's been a clear indication. I think that placated a lot of fears among the Germans, who are more pro-Russian than we may believe them to be. And so what the signs that you'll see will be, for example, increase, like if you were to see gas lines blow up, something like that would be huge. I mean, that would be huge. I just don't think that the U.S. has a win-win situation at all. I think anything that they do, whether they act, without haste, then it will push Europe quicker to encourage Russia to resolve the situation. And I don't mean using the Russian military either. I just think that it would be pushing public support, European media, European public support in favor of recognizing the breakaway republics in the East. But what we will know very soon, and I think what will be a big sign, is whether the U.S. is going to go Samson, is whether they want to actually right now, today, create a civil war, basically in Russia's underbelly. Will be if there are something like 5 or 6 or 7,000 people dead in the next 2 weeks. I think something like that you would see. I think that Russia would have to do something more direct and more visible than what we've seen so far. Absolutely. But the thing is, Paul,
the problem. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, it just seems to me that that Putin is already in a position where he's already been showing the Germans that, and I mean the German ruling elite, that that the instigators of the violence are obviously the U.S. And I just don't think that it's a question anymore. And I think the Germans are also upset that the NSA is tapping their lines too. And while I agree that there's a larger cabal of bankers who are transnational, having been involved in politics in California, I know that the political races are, while they're staged, there's a very real element of it on the ground level. And I think in the national level, it's also it has another dimension of reality, and I think that it is possible to buck the international bankers on national levels, and that different elites that are, say, industrialists but not connected, but that they don't benefit from certain interest rate structures will, I mean, we're talking about elites going at it between themselves, right?
Oh, I totally agree with you, but I would just say a couple of things. First of all, I'm not convinced that Germany and the EU are not to blame for what happened in the Ukraine. The radicalization that has occurred there over the last X number of decades, didn't just happen because of the U.S.
Right.
I mean, a lot of this came out of Germany or Poland or whatever.
I think one of the most recent statements out of the State Department is that they're now turning the blame onto Germany and the EU because they're essentially saying that the EU lobbied for Ukraine to pull totally away from Russia instead of adopting a centrist role. So that would back up what you're saying, Paul.
Yeah, there's that. And then I think the other problem, Joaquin, I have here, which, I mean, we'll never resolve, but we'll just have to see how it plays out, is, Joaquin, what you've been saying is rational.
Right.
But now we get into the question of when people get desperate, how rational are they? Because if the U.S. has to back down here, after basically having to back down in Syria, I think this would be a huge blow to America's perceived prestige, the prestige of a mafia don, right?
Again, to go back to the crazies at the State Department, I believe someone by the name of Anne-Marie Slaughter had just made public statements that in order to show Russia that the U.S. is serious, they should start bombing Syria. I mean, this is the level of lunacy that these people have.
Right. In other words, they talk about seriousness, and their perception of seriousness is that everyone does what you want or else you kill them, and or hurt them badly. And so what you've been describing is like the EU kind of moving away from the U.S. over the Ukrainian issue and kind of seeing eye to eye with Russia. And that makes perfect sense. I think that's entirely feasible. But I just think that from the perspective of a lot of power brokers in the U.S., this would be two tough pills to swallow in a row. And I'm not sure they've finished swallowing the Syrian one. I just think they're looking at it every day longingly. You know what I mean? They're just like, going back, and every day they ask people in the military, are you sure we can't do it?
Right.
What if we do this? What if we do? You sure we can't do it? These guys don't like to take no for an answer.
Right. Well, if there was any ally of Russia today that it could foresee realistically as being a way for the U.S. to save face and to not make any progress in Syria or Iran, and to not get their way in Ukraine, but would be a sign that the U.S. was going to completely reorient their power projection, would be to get for the U.S. to get more involved in Venezuela and in Latin America, and to kind of return to the Monroe Doctrine. And if I think Russia would regrettably and thinking pragmatically be willing to sacrifice Maduro and to sacrifice some of their connections in
Korea.
Right.
I think Ecuador is the
Korea, and
tragic
there's a few
case.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that.
Well, first of all, I don't think Russia can defend them anyway. Okay, they aren't being protected by Russia except diplomatically.
No, they're not.
Because it's too far away. There's nothing Russia can do.
Yeah,
Russia never could defend.
Right.
Never had aircraft carriers or whatever that were really going to make a difference. And so, that certainly the U.S. could do that. Although I think the U.S. has been talking a lot about the pivot to Asia and fighting China. So I don't know. Do you think that Putin, Russia and China will sign the big gas deal that everyone talks about?
Did you say would you repeat the
Russia
question?
Russia and China. The talk is that I guess at the end of May or something, Putin's supposed to go to Peking and sign the gas, mother of all gas deals, the 30-year, multi-billion-dollar gas deal.
Yeah, that will definitely happen, and Russia needs, and I think China's holding the cards in this case too with that deal, and I think that China's going to get a real sweet deal, because it's not just a regular deal. It's actually Russia showing that it doesn't, that any increase in sanctions from Europe or basically Europe isn't going to affect Russia's ability to sell its product. So and I think that China is going to be the main winner in that deal. I think that Russia will will sell at a much better rate than what they sell to anyone in Europe.
Yeah, and also Russia's just written off 90% of its debt from North Korea, and the speculation is that's to put the pipeline to South Korea.
Yeah, I mean, North Korea is basically under the protectorship of China, and so I think that when we see Russia doing something like that, this is actually connected to its relationship with China. It's not. It's almost impossible to speak of a relationship of North Korea on its own, and I don't tend to think that the U.S. believes that it can, build up its naval forces in the Pacific over the next 15 years to some critical density. I don't think that is in line with my understanding of military doctrine, and nor does it make sense economically. And it would just seem to be, and again, maybe the world's not as rational as I imagine it to be, but it seems that the most rational thing for them to focus on expanding their influence back into Latin America, where they've lost it since 15 years ago with the beginning of the pink tide. And so, I mean, it just, and I think Russia would actually support, because we're talking about finding areas where the US and Russia can agree and how they might de-escalate from Ukraine. I think that the U.S. kind of accomplished its Plan B goals for Syria already by destroying the infrastructure and setting back a regional competitor for Israel in economic terms. And so, but I don't think they're going to remove
down the pipelines, slowing down the Iranian pipelines.
Right.
That's true. Well, I would say another thing, though. Let's be honest. The U.S. Wants to sell weapons.
Right.
And so part of the pivot to Asia is to just try to gin up weapons sales. There is just that mundane military-industrial complex angle. So I think you have to keep that in there. But, as far as the sanity and all that, we'll just have to wait and see. But it has been declassified that a couple of times President Kennedy essentially received, the plans for a first nuclear strike on the Soviet Union. I guess once from Dulles at the CIA and once from, from the Joint Chiefs. I don't remember how. But, basically, I forget. But, once he came out and he was talking to people, along the lines of, there's no sanity and no humanity in this earth or something like that.
Yeah.
Because for no reason to have a first strike where you're going to see, such incredible death and destruction just because you think you'll have a little bit more power at the end of it shows the insanity that was at high enough levels that the head of the CIA or the the Joint Chiefs would end up seriously presenting it. And that doesn't mean they were going to do it, but it means they were feeling Kennedy out.
Yes.
And that's a pretty sad state of affairs where that it's that high a level. And again, I don't think they actually wanted to do it. I think it was a maneuver, but still, you're the one who said it feels like 1910. So
it does. I mean, it could, because I think that there is when you analyze the different power circles that run the United States, there is such a thing as the perfect combination of elites that if that group, I mean, in general, to back up, these groups are, form like interlocking directorates. And so different, boards are connected like the Olympic rings, right? But there is a combination of elites that could completely afford to have the United States completely nuked, because all of their investments and all of their productivity and all of their property is outside of the United States, and it's diversified all over the globe, even behind so-called enemy lines. And so they would,
and
I don't know,
underground and under the ocean and in the skies.
Maybe in Denver, right? I mean,
because they've been putting trillions into the secret budgets, and so they've got space technology that they're about ready to roll out, and you know what I mean. In other words, it's not just a question of nukes; it's a question of these guys, like in the Naval Space Command or whatever, may have things that we can't even be sure of. And to what extent? Now, I'm not saying they've got them totally tested, because these things might be hard to use, but still, it's not exactly a secret that the eugenics people didn't go away, and
Right.
and there are quotes from famous people like was it Nehru? Anyway, the head of India for a long time. When Nelson Rockefeller came over, after Rockefeller went back to the States, I think it was Nehru said, you know, that Rockefeller guy is a very strange man. All he wanted to talk about and see was underground bunkers for nuclear war. Right?
Right.
And it's
Right.
and it's like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. These guys are kind of like strange in the head. And their mind is on things like nuclear war. And this was, of course, back in the 1960s. So, granted, it was the Cold War and we had duck and cover, but still, I mean, isn't that a bit strange? You'd go all the way to India in the 1960s and, you know, please show me all your, you know, nuclear bunkers.
Right.
It just strikes one as a bit weird. So I don't know.
Does.
We'll have to see. But you know, you're right though. The U.S. did get like its Plan B or Plan C out of Syria. It didn't totally lose, but I don't know that that's how they feel about it. You know what I mean? You and I
Right.
objectively, like if we were working for a military think tank, we would say, well, we got, you know, Plan C. Right? But,
And
you
then
know,
we'd be
those
told
guys
not
may
to know.
not see it that way. They may
Right.
see it like, yeah, but from their point of view, Russia got Plan A. You know what I mean?
Right.
Russia
I mean,
managed to gain a lot of prestige by essentially backing the U.S. down.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at how these power elites build support among themselves for these plans through their different, you know, committees and organizations with, you know, Bilderberg Trilateral and so forth, Committee of Present Danger, and all these different groupments, you know, some are more industrialist, some are more financial, some are more international, some are more national. So, you know, at the end of the day, you have people, so long as they're, you know, 51% on board with some aspect of it, they go along with it. But and I think you're right, as, you know, say Plan A doesn't work, but they got Plan B, but, you know, the people who are on board only because of Plan A are, you know, pissed off, right? So these kinds of partial defeats or partial victories have a divisive effect among the ruling elite. And I think moving forward that kind of thing is going to play a critical role in analyzing how they hate each other. Different people hate each other now over Syria, talking about among American elites. What's going to happen when they back out of Ukraine? I think you're absolutely right, Paul. That's a great question. I think it's a profound rhetorical question. I think you're right. It's unanswerable. How will they handle a second major setback in terms of their international credibility?
Well, how about we take an example? Okay, so I'm here in Japan, and the current Japanese government is trying to be assertive, right? In many ways. They want to build a military. They're being confrontational with China. They have more and more obviously come out in the open with their poor relations with South Korea and their backdoor relations with North Korea. And most importantly, they're trying to invest very, very heavily in Russia.
Right.
Tens of billions of dollars. And the U.S. doesn't like this.
No.
Not at all. And so far, they've just said, we don't care. We're doing it.
Right. And then we saw what happened with the Fukushima.
Well, yeah, now we have to ask about we definitely have to ask questions about that. But some of this has happened after Fukushima. But be that as it may, the point is, you can see it's obvious the U.S. is leaning on Japan very heavily, but Japan has been resisting. And I would bet that if the U.S. doesn't get its way in the Ukraine, then that will make it easier for Japan to resist. So we're talking a worldwide issue here. American prestige, as I said, is unfortunately really largely based on force. Yes, the dollar, but the dollar is backed up by force, let's face it.
Right, that's what it's backed up.
I mean, come on, it's not based on how many lies the latest Federal Reserve chief has said, or the
Right,
president
right,
or something. It's not based
right,
on taxes. It's based on the
right,
U.S. military. Let's be
right.
serious,
It's the military.
because that
Right,
controls the sea lanes, and that's how people
right.
get their oil and their food, right? How does Japan
Exactly.
or whoever get oil and food? Through the permission of the U.S. Navy. I tell you what, we're going to wrap it up soon, but I've got one last thing for you, and that is there anything we haven't gotten around to that you think is worth discussing before we wrap it up?
Well, the thing is that you touched on some really critical issues relating to technologies that have been developed through black budgets and so forth. And, what I'm kind of interested in hearing from you, what kind of things you think might happen in a worst case scenario in Ukraine, or maybe more openly, how would you relate this view of the black budget and military to what we might see in Ukraine?
Wow, that's not a topic to finish on. That's a topic to start on, Joaquin. The black budget and what it represents, because it's kind of like there's a twofold issue. The incredible corruption and waste that we've seen in the military, a lot of that originally was not true. A lot of it was fake. It was to put all the money in the black budget. But as the country has got, and I'm familiar with this from family too, in rockets and fighters, anyway, different things. And so a lot of it wasn't waste, okay? But now we're talking 40 years ago, 30 years ago. More and more, I think it has not as much waste. It's just become ineffective. I mean, whatever. Some of the fighter jets, some of the things are not, considering the amount of time and money they put into these things, they're just not that impressive. So I think, as opposed to, let's say, corruption, it's more like the fall of the Soviet Union, where people stop believing in the system.
Right.
In other words, it's poor morale that has affected, I think, the military system, procurement system, more than anything. But that's a long topic. As far as the actual black budget, the stuff in the sky and under the oceans and all that, it's plentiful, it's huge. But again, how much is because they could do it, right? In other words, putting stuff under the ocean or underground made sense because then satellites can't see it, right?
Right.
And so let's say there's an underground train system from the East Coast to the West Coast of the U.S. Okay, that makes perfect sense. And let's say they spent X number of hundreds of billions of dollars on it. But it doesn't really change anything in the broader scheme of things, does it?
No, it doesn't.
So it's a mixed bag. And the stuff in space, I think, is quite real. I think they have it. But some of it, I don't think, is quite ready for war as much as it is for exploration. Anyway, this is a very long, tough topic, and I just can't really answer. And this is all speculation. I mean, listeners can listen to people like Joseph Farrell and Richard Dolan, and actually, I think it's in June. You might be aware, in the San Francisco Bay Area, maybe the Silicon Valley, there's going to be a conference on the breakaway civilization concept, and that's what we're discussing here. Is there an advanced civilization that's kind of started within military-industrial complexes, and it's now so advanced that they kind of don't take orders? In other words, they don't listen to the president, or they don't listen to even, let's say, Putin. They're, whoever has the rockets in space or under the oceans, they just kind of have their own division. And this is quite speculative, and it's worth looking into. But as far as it being relevant in the case of the Ukraine, I kind of doubt it, to be honest. I think that first of all, I suspect that if they were willing and able to use it, they would have used it over Syria. If they had a secret gun that they could put to Putin's head, I think they would have done it then. And just my gut feeling, no proof, but just a gut feeling. So I don't know that there is this secret gun that they're so easily doing. But I do think the doctrine has been to try to get to a first strike capacity. I think the U.S. wants to be able to take Russia out as a just general, if needed kind of thing. But
well, let me ask you. Well, what about? I mean, because if we're looking at a situation in say the 20 or 30% chance that things escalate very dangerously in Ukraine, and you've got people with their fingers near buttons, if you know what I'm saying. How does it factor in the possibility of there being people who maybe broke away from our civilization a million years ago, or maybe from somewhere nearby, off not on Earth, who are in our neighborhood who don't want to see a nuclear war? I mean, I remember seeing reports and testimony from various people in military who work right where the ICBM test launches were conducted, and when they detected these entities or presences, they weren't able to engage actually in test launch sequences.
Yeah, I've heard those rumors before as well about the ICBMs being shut down and power being shut down. But
right.
Again, it's hard to separate fact from fiction, and it may be true or it may not. We really can't say for certain.
Right.
Well, I'm going to say one problem with this, and I'm not denying any of this, but I'm going to say that the military-industrial complex people have promoted the whole UFO meme for a long time as a cover for what they're actually up to. And I mean, as an example, I visited the U.S., I don't know when it was, 5 years ago or something. And, when traveling, I'd turn on the TV, and it was very depressing. It was all like Homeland Security, SWAT team, right, war. It was really like, can I leave this earth? I'm tired of it. This is ridiculous. But that's what was on the TV, all these different violent kind of things. And so I came along, and there was this show on Roswell, the famous crash, right? And and so anyway, the conclusion is they said there was more than one crash. And look, I'm no expert in Roswell, but anyway, they said there was more than one crash, and they went and they said they found this place, and they found some kind of plastic or thing, and they got it analyzed. Anyway, they said, look, we're convinced this is where, a part of a crash happened. And we got this debris, we got it analyzed, and it's some kind of plastic. And that plastic wasn't invented until, let's say, 1952 or something, right? And they're saying this proves that they were aliens because the crash happened in 1947. And now, to me, actually, that proves that it was an alien, because if they came from, millions of years away and all this other kind of stuff, I don't think they're using some plastic that, anyone who's worked in technology or military stuff knows that they get stuff 10 or 20 years or whatever before it goes on the public market. And yeah, there's some patent, and the newspapers say so-and-so invented it, but I'm telling you that that's not typically the case. The military had it 10 or 20 years ago. And particularly, I mean, come on, a plastic? Are you kidding me?
Right.
If you had some like living metal, okay, fine.
Right.
That's alien, right? Okay, then I'm listening. I'm interested. But this is just, BS, right? And so I'm sorry in that case. But anyway, my point though is they're promoting this idea, and I do think that it's very likely that there are these things out there that regularly come, and they may even be from another dimension or other things that are a little bit weirder than Star Trek. That would actually, like you're saying, they could be us who somehow avoided the last time we blew this planet up or something, right?
Right.
There are brothers who got stuck in distant colonies when we once again destroyed ourselves here, or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
And they want us to not destroy ourselves again. Yeah, sure, that's all possible, but I don't know that the Ukraine is a case where this is relevant. I think it was more like the Cuban Missile Crisis or something. You know what I mean? They're probably, I don't know that this is something that can go nuclear. For one thing, NATO can't do anything about the Ukraine. If you just look at the numbers, and then I mean, look, they're talking about putting a few hundred people here and there, or a few planes. I mean, are you kidding me?
Right.
These are joke numbers. They wouldn't even make any difference at all in terms of what Russia could do and how quickly Russia could do it.
Right.
So I don't think that's it. The point is to break the relations between the EU and Russia, and to make NATO relevant, right?
Right.
In a saner world, NATO would have gone away.
Sure, 20 years
right?
ago.
I mean,
right.
Russia would have agreed to like demilitarize largely, up to Moscow or whatever, and Eastern Europe would have agreed to demilitarize. You know what I mean? Some,
right?
And everybody would have saved money, and everyone would be happy, right? So in other words, NATO is like a way of the U.S. getting its financial, profits in there, and along with it comes control. Like the Operation Gladio people. They couldn't operate. If NATO didn't exist, it would be much harder to do the whole Gladio, intimidate or kill politicians in Europe. So I think it's kind of like that. So I don't really think it's relevant to discuss so much. And anyway, how can we know? I mean, how would we know what, some alien group might want to do? It's really a bit...
Right. Well, I guess what I'm getting to, Paul, is if we're going to rule out aliens, secret technology, and nuclear warfare, if we're going to rule out those three things, and we're talking about a conventional land war in Eurasia, then I think that all of the, saner generals in the State Department are saying, no way, cut your losses, or make the right deal, or, make the right people happy that you got to make happy, but get the hell out of there. And I say that there's a 70% chance that Russia takes, Malorussia without extreme incident, and I predict casualties between 3,000 and 4,000. And after the first week of June, everything will be very clear.
Well, considering the United States couldn't even take on a couple goat herders in Afghanistan, I don't think they're equipped to go into Ukraine at all.
Right. I mean, if we're going to rule out the big kind of meta issues, and if nuclear war is out, and if there really isn't any practical usable technology that we don't know about, that hasn't been tested sufficiently, and if the coalition, if NATO can't be involved because we know Germany's not going to want to get involved and Italy's not going to want to get involved, then whatever happens in Ukraine is going to be almost purely a U.S. initiative, and it's going to be basically based on Blackwater. And given, as I said, the significant language problems and command problems and the lack of volunteers and the reliance on mercenaries and the non-existence of the real Ukrainian military, I chalk up the Ukraine scenario as a victory for Russia, however we want to call that.
Yeah, I can certainly see that. I just would say that there are things, it's a very, very complicated chess game here. Putin and the Russian establishment are going to be under a lot of pressure. Every death, every fire, pogrom, everything like that is now big news inside Russia. And, every day hundreds or thousands of people are screaming and calling from eastern Ukraine, help us. Right. And Putin did essentially tell them that he had their back. Remember, he said they won't be crazy enough. We won't intervene unless they go crazy and massacre people.
Well, we get back to that Russian expression that it takes them a long time to saddle their horse, but once they start to ride, they ride very fast, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yes, that's true, and I don't think we have to worry about him being a pacifist. So I don't think that's a problem here. But I do think I think they're under pressure, and so the question of who has time on his side, generally speaking, I think it's Russia. But I mean, you got to have strong nerves here.
Hey, you got to commit to a position, Paul. You just got to commit.
That's true. That you're right on that. And I think he's a strong enough character, and so That's what they're doing. Well, I tell you what, let's wrap it up here. We've gotten in enough time for this episode, and we'll get this out as soon as we can so that everyone can hear, your thoughts on what's going down there. So, Joaquin, we thank you for coming.
Glad I was here.
Okay, and Jerry, thanks for coming along.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, take care. That's it. It's a wrap.